I thank you, ma'am, for your all comprehensive and lecture and encompassing different facets in the field of research, opportunities in the field of higher education in the UK and in India. I'm sure our students would have some queries, questions in that regard. Now, I take the opportunity to invite Professor Janet Wilson, Professor of English and Postcolonial Studies at the University of Northampton. She is also editor of the Journal of Postcolonial Writing, and she's also chair of European Association of Commonwealth Language and Literature. I request Madam to deliver her lecture on postcolonialism and after. The session is all yours, ma'am.
Thank you. Thanks, Lisa. It's this one, is it? To take this line down.
Up and down, and then this one too. Just be careful when you,
I'm reading that.
yeah, it jumps.
Yeah.
So,
Good. It's a great pleasure to be here at the Open University at Ahmedabad, and we're looking forward very much to developing the collaborations between the consortia of universities that Lisa and I are here to set up. In this talk, as she's indicated, I will give an in-depth overview of one area of potential collaboration between the consortia of universities, and that is in post-colonial studies. And I want to start by challenging the very title of this talk, which suggests that post-colonialism is either outdated or about to meet its demise. In fact, it comes from the title of a book, Postcolonialism and After, published in 2000 by E. San Juan Jr. on this very subject. Predictions of the death of post-colonialism and complaints about its exhaustion as a theoretical paradigm or of a crisis in post-colonial studies have proliferated since the start of the new millennium, provoking debate and discussion and a range of publications such as the volume of essays edited by Anya Lumba et al., Postcolonial Studies and Beyond, 2005. Of course, this is not surprising. At one level, the historical framework and geopolitical realities out of which the field developed on the waning of empires and the decolonisation of colonies is somewhat outdated, and so it seemingly puts its main focus of endeavour firmly in the past. There is also the encroachment of globalisation, which Lisa has already mentioned as a key area for contemporary studies, a field of inquiry associated with the social sciences, and a phenomenon which to many people constitutes the dominant perspective through which to view the contemporary moment. The dominant paradigm of empires and colonies, the politicised binaries of coloniser-colonised, metropolitan centres and colonial peripheries, seem now to have little relevance in a world which today is increasingly comprised of what the Indian critic Arjun Appadurai calls border-crossing free flows of mediascapes, ethnoscapes, financescapes, and so on. So in this talk, I will address the status and relevance of the post-colonial paradigm in a changing theoretical, political, and educational landscape, and I will argue that it has already made crucial adjustments which will ensure its continuity, if not longevity. If post-colonialism had developed no further than the anti-colonial political activism and the discourses of resistance to which it traces its origin, then there may be a case that it is being eclipsed today by forces like globalisation, which require urgent attention. But by becoming institutionalised and by evolving a pedagogy based on colonial discourse analysis and a reading practice which demands critical and resisting readers, the post-colonial field, which has only really established itself in the last 30 years since the publication of Edward Said's seminal text Orientalism in 1978, has in fact ensured a capacity for self-reconstitution. Post-colonial studies are mainly taught in the humanities and social sciences, while post-colonial theory has traditionally been associated with the teaching of post-colonial literature in English departments, which engage with texts and cultures which traditionally have been outside the established English canon. And where it has attracted a degree of critical scepticism as well as self-reflexive revisionism amongst practitioners. One of the problems has been the degree of abstractness which came with institutionalisation, as post-colonial theory absorbed post-structuralist and historicist ideas. This meant that for some post-colonial critics and intellectuals in the Third World, a refinement of persistent inequality and the evils of neo-globalization, such as poverty and corruption, into well-built theories which drifted even further away from the conditions they purported to describe. A number of practitioners, then, have been tinged by ambivalence, creating a permanent self-exculpatory position of self-critique. But this has meant, paradoxically, that the developments in theory which threaten to remove post-colonialism from its ethical roots defines a movement which is metamorphosed to meet its critiques and is constantly adapting its models and coming up with new ideas. Along with this ongoing analysis of gaps and weaknesses in the enterprise, then, comes a capacity for adjustment, expansion, and change. This inheres in post-colonial theory itself, surprisingly, the strengths of which are its capacity to infuse and diffuse itself into diverse and often seemingly incompatible fields of engagement and geopolitical vistas. Its decolonizing energy, political as well as ideological and cultural, is effective precisely because it disrupts monolithic ideologies. It can destabilize grand narratives of both cultural modernity and anti-colonial resistance. So when there is a move to study new intellectual and geopolitical territories, which might be called obliquely post-colonial, such as global China, East Central Europe after the fall of the Soviet Union, post-apartheid South Africa, first slide, it is possible to adapt theoretical paradigms to analyse unusual political circumstances and to address ideological constructions of such cultures in ways which both define and disrupt their centralising normative assumptions. Postcolonialism is also marked by a sense of potentially uncharted territory as it diversifies into new disciplinary areas like eco-criticism and diaspora studies. These are being supplemented by the retrieval and reassertion of the pedagogical and ethical import of the post-colonial in conjunction with its aesthetic potential, which is taken up through new models of textual interpretation. Finally, it has adapted its discourses of resistance and politicised critique to the new demands of globalisation and neo-imperialism, while also showing a reinvigorated engagement with these same areas, resistance and liberation, which traditionally have constituted its strength. Therefore, I see that the conceptual and disciplinary challenges posed by globalisation, and I refer to the second point on the slide, have led to a readjustment in the last decade as post-colonial practitioners focus more on the neo-imperial practices that mark out the global condition, showing a shift away from the earlier predominantly literary critical explorations of the 1980s and the vogue for the theoretical and cultural which marked out the 90s. The temporal horizons of the field now focus less on the narrative of decolonisation than on neo-colonial imbalances in the post-colonial present, inequalities, poverty, oppression. Hence, there is reason to agree with Lumba et al. In their introduction to post-colonial studies and beyond that, quote, it is important to go beyond a certain kind of post-colonial studies in order to engage with the imperial formations and ideologies associated with globalisation. And in the second half of this talk, I'm going to talk more about post-colonialism's engagement with globalisation. I will move on to talk about post-colonial pedagogies, and in the conclusion, I will sum up some of the points where post-colonialism can see a future for itself. In describing what going beyond might consist of, I refer to an essay collection, next slide please, I have recently edited for Routledge called Rerouting the Postcolonial, New Directions for the New Millennium, which aims to show how the field is developing under the impact not just of globalisation, but also of environmentalism, religious fundamentalism, and transnational formations which may either be political and economic, such as neoliberal ideologies, or cultural, such as the Transnation, or the Global, or the Cosmopolitan. The term rerouting in the collection's title plays on the homophones of roots and roots. Roots, spelt R-O-O-T-S, associated with origins, location, place, and roots, spelt R-O-U-T-E-S, associated with travel and its attendant meanings of uprooting, rerouting, new directions, and reconceptualizations of space. These terms and their interrelated but oppositional meanings encapsulate the way that transformative ideas of relocation stemming from the discourses of migration, diaspora, dislocation, and the new mobile spaces offered by cosmopolitan travel have highlighted the need for new approaches and areas of investigation. Next slide, please. I and my co-editors argue in the introduction that the topics and issues commonly associated with the discipline, diasporic and minoritorian subjectivities, global networks of power, metropolitan immigrant communities, are now being treated in ways that show that the post-colonial project has come to embrace a much larger set of intellectual positions than is commonly presumed, and that it brings into dialogue diverse scholarly agendas and scholarly practices. In fact, as Canadian critic Diana Bryden says, its decolonising energies are being dispersed within much broader fields of engagement, to the extent that in some cases a project may be informed by post-colonial thinking without actually categorising itself as post-colonial or acknowledging post-colonial influence as such. There are many different related fields of endeavour which grapple with questions within different frames of grapple with interconnected questions within different frames of reference. Running through the collection, and what I would like to focus on here, is a renewed engagement with global imaginaries, as I have in the first point on the handout here, on the slide. Global imaginaries is a term which, according to the theorist Edouard Glissant, means the way a culture has of perceiving and conceiving of the world, and it implies definitions of community and culture as constantly under construction, rather than fixed in nature. One might, of course, question the impact of globalization. For example, is it really anything new, or is it just a more contemporary refiguring of the familiar capitalist mode of production? We might also argue that globalization is in retreat, especially with credit crunch and the current economic crisis, which suggest a failure of some of its policies. But what is clear is that the current globalizing of culture and society has brought to the fore global problems requiring global solutions, of the sort that require terms like imaginaries to be translated across different geospatial locations, disciplinary formations, and frameworks of theoretical allegiance. I move to the next point on the slide, reconceptualizations of cosmopolitanism. A new strand of thinking about cosmopolitanism is being advocated by a number of critics, as this is a term which encourages an interface between post-colonial and theories of globalization, because of its implications of citizenship, of civilized conversation, conviviality, and heightened political responsibilities. Rerouting the post-colonial, as one contributor to our collection says, requires the deliberate cultivation of cosmopolitan allegiances, because the resistance to globalization requires more than ever the encouragement of complex, provisional, and itinerant loyalties. It also requires new and more attentive types of readers of texts who have more politically informed reading practices and modes of critique. Secondly, is the redefining of cosmopolitanism in relation to the new articulations of transnationalism and neoliberalism as a way of addressing the mobility, contingency, and variable cultural positions of subjects in an increasingly globalized world. There is a call to expand the term from its association with elite, privileged Western minorities who have the money to travel around the world and return home to go sightseeing, to gain a liberal education. There is a call to expand the term from its association by Simon Gikandi and Anthony Appiah in the recognition that the occupation of spaces outside national territories and the current global mobilization of peoples requires new discursive modes. Speaking of cosmopolitanism in relation to locality, Gikandi draws attention to the limitations of the current theoretical vocabulary to articulate the experiences of post-colonial lives lived beyond national boundaries, both in the midst of and paradoxically at the margins of the global international system. The experiences of refugees, nomads, asylum seekers, who are often excluded from Western cosmopolitan discourses such as diaspora theories. The new thinking about cosmopolitanism also engages with post-colonial arguments about the category of the nation, which either rehearse its demise or its renewal in relation to globalization. For national cultural imaginaries, by contrast to global imaginaries, which until recently have been the mode through which the imaginary of the world system has operated, are now being challenged by globalization and supplemented by other forms of cultural and social imaginaries which can operate at subnational or at supranational levels. The deterritorialization which comes with globalization has led to the weakening of the concept of the nation-state and the national imaginary, although these remain principal sites for the articulation of subjects' rights, even while being engines of globalization. Post-colonial critiques of the nation as an exclusionary political formation are the source of what Bill Ashcroft has called the Transnation, which is a way of thinking about the world of movement both within and beyond the nation, which reflects the, quote, rhizomic interplay of travelling subjects, unquote. This can also be seen as a kind of cosmopolitan utopianism, a quintessentially human space where global and local imaginaries might mingle. Ashcroft distinguishes what he calls the smooth space of the transnation, a space of potentiality, from the striated space of the state, where institutions and government categories exist, where order is imposed, where there is a kind of structure that controls citizens. What he calls the literary transnation, therefore, is not only unbound by nationalism, but has the capacity to embody potentiality. Its transformative impetus is linked to the utopian functions of literature, which embodies the imagination's power to envisage a better world. So this is the third point on my slide. I now move to the final point, postcolonialism's utopianism. This utopian potential can also be detected in the development of interconnected epistemologies of the global and the local. Hence, a glocal sensibility and a border thinking stem from the non-conflictual embrace of several different systems, localities and traditions, including faith-based practices. Because, as the Canadian critic Diana Bryden argues, it is possible to live attuned to different temporal and civilizational systems. The glocal allows for distinct levels of individual and collective identity to be expressed and for ethical imperatives and representational choices to be brought together.